partners across the Middle East, in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Bizet University. My name is Adam Coots. I'm an academic at the University of Cambridge, and I'm pleased to welcome three distinguished speakers for this timely event, given current ongoing events such as the partners on COVID across the Middle East, in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Bizet University. My name is Adam Coots. I'm an academic at the University of Cambridge, and I'm pleased to welcome three distinguished speakers for this timely event, given current ongoing events such as there's a bit of a technical issue on the line. The COVID pandemic and the change in US administration. Format will be a fireside chat with Stephen and Hamish, with Sir Christopher Greenwood chairing. Just a bit of housekeeping. We aim to run for about just over an hour, so 30 minutes of discussion and then 20 to 30 minutes Q&A. Also, today's event will be live streamed on YouTube and recorded. Thank you, and now over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Adam. Well, chairing a meeting of this kind, I feel rather like Melvyn Bragg chairing an episode of In Our Time, if any of you have ever listened to those. And I've certainly got specialists with me, even more impressive specialists than Melvyn normally has. Let me introduce my colleagues. First of all, Sir Stephen O'Brien, a former Member of Parliament and Minister in the coalition government, and also he was UN Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Right Honourable Sir Stephen O'Brien. Stephen, it's very good to have you with us this evening.
Thank you, Chris. Delighted.
Thank you. And then Hamish de Bretton Gordon, the author of the book Chemical Warrior, which is in part, at least, what we're going to be talking about. Hamish, you've put your copies of the book so far behind you that it's actually rather difficult to see in the picture, so I thought I'd hold mine up. Hamish has a history in the armed forces of being in charge of our approach to dealing with chemical weapons, and has as much boots on the ground experience as you could possibly imagine. Going back, for example, to 30 years ago today, when you were just finishing the Iraq conflict, were you not, Hamish?
Absolutely.
And I'm also delighted that Hamish has been elected as a visiting fellow of Magdalen College, and I've been hoping to welcome him there when I took over as master in October. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic has put a stop to our visiting fellows programme for the time being, but Hamish, we're still very much looking forward to seeing you when some sort of normal contact can be resumed. Now, the form is, as Adam has just explained, that we're going to have a discussion among the three of us, which I shall chair in a fairly loose fashion, and then throw the floor open to questions. But please feel free to add questions as the conversation goes along. You can do that by using the Q&A facility, which, if I've mastered the technology, is the rightmost of the bottom icons at the bottom of the web screen. So please feel free to put in whatever questions you would like, and then we'll come to those and work our way through them. So Hamish, can I begin with you? Could you tell us what it was that inspired you to write this book and how your experience led to the writing of it?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Christopher, and I feel honoured, almost as a sort of imposter syndrome, being part of the great Magdalen College, but not being there. And I hope that certainly next term that might well be possible. The book itself, there were three reasons that I wrote it. Very apposite, the first two, to what we're going to discuss today. I feel a heartfelt issue that the Syrian people have been terribly let down by the international community, including our own country. I've been in and out of Syria since the beginning of the war, ostensibly collecting evidence and working with NGOs. And as you say, 30 years ago today, I was a young officer fighting in the first Gulf War, which I think really honed my thinking, to one of our more successful interventions. Allied to that, I've worked very closely with the Iraqi Kurds, and I think we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. I was their chemical weapons advisor in the fight with Islamic State in 2015 to 2017. And I think, it was them who predominantly led the fight against ISIS. Their boots on the ground meant that we, the Brits, did not have to put boots on the ground. And I really think the debt of gratitude to them is huge. The second reason, as you said, I've spent most of my life in the chemical and biological counter-terrorism world. And actually with the Peshmerga, we were gassed by Islamic State near Mosul in 2016. So I have very personal experience of what it's like for these weapons to be used on them. And I've seen them used in Syria, and they're absolutely abhorrent. They're indiscriminate. They mainly affect those who can't protect themselves, civilians, women and children. And the fact that they've been used in a widespread way by the Syrians and recently by the Russians. I'm talking to you from Salisbury, where we had the Salisbury nerve agent attack 2 years ago. So I really wanted to get the debate going on that, and allied to that, biological weapons, which I think we should talk about COVID, because I'm not suggesting in any way it's a biological weapon, but it could be. And there is too much biological engineering going on in various laboratories around the world where accidents or thefts could happen. And the legal framework dealing with biological and toxic weapons is very thin. And the third reason, very selfish, I have two medical conditions: cardiac sudden death syndrome, which sounds very dramatic. It is if you don't know you've got it. And I really shout for them. Whenever you hear of young boys and girls dying on sports pitches, most of the time it's sudden cardiac death syndrome. So I'm trying to get more publicity for that, to get people tested. And like many people of my age, I also have prostate cancer, luckily the not so bad bit, and trying to push people to make sure they get tested so we can get rid of this dreadful disease. But in around that's where the book came from, and hopefully, my turning from a soldier to a humanitarian has been a challenging thing. But I like to think that I've got a few things, bit of advice or a voice to speak about these particular areas.
Hamish, thank you very much. That's extremely helpful and very moving. Stephen, you've had experience both in politics, but also in humanitarian diplomacy at a very high level. What would you add to that?
Well, I will certainly be very interested to hear from Hamish how he has found his makeup and experience of, unquestionably, when you read the book, which is a really good read. I do recommend everybody to get hold of a copy. Of innate courage, but at the same time compassion, and it applies both to the military experience and to the humanitarian experience, particularly when you read about the determination to get into Syria to get the samples. And so I'm very interested, Hamish, to understand how, and you're very open and honest about this, how the sort of mental makeup and the motivations have driven you to feel this real determination to sort of deliver a form of justice, which is about, particularly for innocent people caught up in conflicts. And the background to my question, as Sir Christopher has just indicated, is having been on the political side, where one has to make choices about what one does. When you find yourself coordinating this world response to humanitarian emergency and people in need, of course, you've only got a few levers to pull. And one of the things that's really striking is that you mentioned that this is the 30th anniversary of the end of the Gulf War I, arguably a good military intervention, just a rather failed post-military intervention. But this is also the anniversary of the time when the office at the UN that I was responsible for was set up, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which was set up to respond to people in need from natural emergencies. But the people in need around the world for those last 30 years have been 90% caused by conflicts. And so this interplay between conflict and need and and the sort of makeup of people we need to go in there and to support, how very important it is to recognise that the motivation to be humanitarian comes from a place not of simply compassion, but also practical and expertise. Hamish.
Okay. Hamish, tell us about that, please, and also in particular about the whole idea of gathering the evidence of what has happened, because, you know, as a former judge, that's one of the things that always struck me, that there are any number of allegations and news stories, particularly about the use of chemical weapons, but actual hard evidence which a court can use is usually a very different matter.
Absolutely, and I think that that is the nub of the issue with chemical and biological weapons. And I think having spent 23 years as a soldier in Iraq, a number of times, Afghanistan, it was very salutary to go into Syria as a civilian and then work with the Peshmerga in Iraq in conflict. And what drove me, I think, was frustration. Particularly with Syria. I think I was with Stephen in the Houses of Parliament in September 2013 when the debate was taking place on whether we should attack Assad for using chemical weapons on his own people. 1,500 people died on the 21st of August 2013 when Assad's forces dropped sarin on Ghouta suburb. And most of those who were killed were women and children. Now, I'd been in Syria before then because there'd been smaller attacks. And when I came back to London to brief people in Whitehall and Westminster, the sort of stock line I got was, it's all very good, Hamish, but we can't do anything without evidence. And that really sort of drove me. And I got incredibly frustrated. In fact, I was arrested at Heathrow on my way back in July 2013 from Syria for allegedly bringing evidence back into the country, which, you know, I wasn't doing. But that sort of drove me on. In my life in the British military, one of the things that we were always doing when chemical or biological weapons were involved was collecting evidence. That chain of evidence is so important that you guys will understand far better than I, but it was driven into me. So then when we had the Ghouta event and Parliament voted not to strike Assad, which eight years later, you know, I think is still a desperately poor decision. You know, had we taken out his chemical arsenal then, I don't think we would be in the position now. Over 5 million civilians, over 500,000 civilians have been killed and 11 million displaced within Syria, and we know the 5 million refugees. So after that, it was then really driven home to me, we must get evidence. And with a very brave Syrian called Hussein, who was a doctor, he was always known as Hazim the Chem. He got in touch with me through Skype, actually, to say, you know, how can you help and set up something called the CBRN task force. And the idea behind that was to set up the hospitals to treat casualties, because one of the hospitals that dealt with most of the casualties in August 2013, run by OSAM, a charity that I support and help, 7 of the 9 doctors treating that morning died from secondary contamination. So the first thing was to educate the Syrians how to deal with these attacks. The second thing was to collect evidence. It was quite clear that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is the UN's policeman, the Chemical Weapons Convention, couldn't get into Syria, number one, because the Syrians aren't signatories to the convention, and number two, it was too dangerous. So it was clear to me the only way that we were going to get evidence out was to organize it and collect it ourselves. And on April 2014, I got a call from Hussein saying there's been a chemical attack in Talamanis and Kafazita. We're there, we've got the evidence, come and analyze it. And I broke off from a skiing holiday, managed to get to the Syrian border pretty quickly, analyzed the samples, which proved that chlorine had been used. And we had 2 samples, and the other samples went to the OPCW, which 9 months later, they agreed with our findings. To me, that was really salutary. And I could go back to Parliament and say, look, this is the hard evidence. But it was, the inflexibility, I think, of the OPCW and the UN, and as you will understand far better than I, actually, because the permanent members of the UN Security Council have a veto, any hard evidence we were getting out of Syria invariably was vetoed by the Russians, and therefore creating the inertia, and therefore not a lot happening. So it was actually seeing it and hearing of so many children, and it's the children who really get you. And having children myself, I describe in the book of being in a hospital where 27 children arrived from a Bora bomb attack, and 26 of them died. And the one girl who survived, I escorted her to the border. And because she didn't have the paperwork, she died there at the border. And it was, the two things that I see when I wake up at night occasionally are her eyes and a little boy who I met in Syria in 2019, who lost both legs and an arm. And they that injustice is something that sort of really keeps me driving on, which is why I'm delighted to have the opportunity at a webinar like this to bring these up. So a very long answer to your question. It was frustration, and the fact that, some of our processes in the UN for collecting this evidence, for a lot of reasons that I'm sure you will be able to explain far better than I can, just are not as effective as they should be. And that's why people like myself, and I'm not, there are other people doing this and doing, much more extreme things. But the whole thing about my humanitarian life is having seen it on both sides, if one can just push the dial a tiny bit and make a tiny bit of difference, and if there are enough of us doing it, one hopefully can achieve things that perhaps, some other governments and huge institutions can't.
I sort of almost feel, Christopher, if I may, I need to turn the question back on you, which is not quite what this webinar is meant to be about, but because I certainly suffered exactly the same in 2016 when the convoy that I had arranged got completely obliterated just outside Aleppo. In fact, you do refer to this in your book. And, we tried so hard very quickly to get people into the site, to seal the site, to preserve the evidence, to then gather the evidence. And the whole time we were simply frustrated as the UN officially, and me making speeches in a very public way. But it didn't cut any ice with those who simply wished to block us, which in that case were the Russians, of course, in support of their proxy, the Syrians. So it turns the question, which is the same as you've just asked, Hamish, back on to Christopher a bit, as to if IHL and the whole process in international humanitarian law and all the processes that we talk about as being our sort of benchmark of where we can move towards some form of accountability for actions across borders, across the world. It does feel, particularly for those of us who've been, as it were, engaged on the ground in whichever way, that it doesn't have teeth, and we're not sure where the teeth may come from. I mean, does that sum up your worry as well, Hamish? And we might put the pressure back on Christopher.
Entirely.
Well, thank you both very much. No, but you're absolutely right. There is a problem generally with international law of teeth. It's not as bad across the board as people imagine it to be. I was 9 years on the International Court of Justice, and one of the extraordinary things about the ICJ is that virtually every judgment it's ever given has been complied with. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a record that you probably wouldn't find matched, for example, if you went to the family courts in this country and asked, how are you faring with enforcing injunctions that requires one parent to allow the other parent custody to the children after a divorce? And nor would it look bad as by comparison, for example, with enforcing consumer judgments against dodgy companies over the sale of anything, secondhand cars, video players, whatever it happens to be. But when you get to humanitarian law, enforcement has always been a particular Achilles heel. And I think that's been recognized going back more than a century. And I think there are three reasons for that. The first is that you're going to the absolute heart of the security issues of a state. And they are, not surprisingly, very reluctant to open their doors in matters like that, particularly where they know that they or their client state is in the wrong. The second is that it's frankly much more fashionable in the diplomatic world to be able to say, well, look at this new treaty we've just negotiated, rather than to say, this isn't a new treaty, it's an old one, but we've actually taken practical steps to implement it. And that can be a real, that's a real political problem. It holds back the idea of enforcement. And the third difficulty is that in recent times, there has at least been one big step forward in enforcement, which is the creation of the International Criminal Court, which isn't just important in itself, it's also led to a tightening up of the law within states, as you can see from this recent conviction in Germany of the Syrian officer. But the focus on criminal prosecution after the event is often at the expense of paying attention to other things. Humanitarian training, for example. Most of the conflicts you've been speaking about are conflicts that have been fought by young, inexperienced, untrained soldiers who are usually terrified. And that's not a group of people who are likely to have given a lot of thought to the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War or the treaties on chemical and biological weapons. So I think we have to, in looking at enforcement, we have to look at getting the evidence, which is really difficult in a great many cases, and particularly with something like chemical weaponry, where if you leave it any length of time, the evidence is gone. You won't be able to acquire it. It's got to be done straight away. And secondly, on training and instilling in the military some kind of what I call a humanitarian reflex. It's a matter of making sure the lawyers don't overcomplicate things as well. I'm afraid my profession is very good at coming up with complicated subtleties. That might be fine when you're arguing a case in the Supreme Court or in the ICJ. It's a very different matter when you're trying to explain a handful of basic rules to a young, newly qualified second lieutenant in an army that perhaps has very little in the way of cohesion. It's a different matter if you're dealing with a very professional force like the British Army. But if you're dealing with some of these that have been put together at the last minute, much harder.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Well, in the light of that, there are a couple of other areas which your book really is quite a good span, Hamish, beyond all this, and of course covers your own life, obviously your personal health issues. I have to say it's an extremely touching love story with your wife, Julia, which I think all of us enjoy that coming through. But in particular, your experience, where does that leave you particularly post Salisbury? And now we've had COVID, where does that leave you with a sense of what lessons do we need to learn and try and put in place to not just better protect ourselves, but to become much more responsible world citizens, to enable us to have a better protection for people around the world, whether they're in conflict or not, but just because of the emerging threat of chemical and biological weapons and substances?
Well, I think that is a really interesting perspective. And just stepping back a second to Sir Chris's point about evidence, you know, one of the huge challenges we had in Syria was, you know, I was there telling people to collect evidence, and they were going, you know, why bother? Assad and the Russians are bombing us. They're bombing hospitals, you know, which is great. The Geneva Convention and everything else. And the frustration I had with the NGOs I was working with is when our hospitals were placed down, as per the UN rules, we were giving the coordinates of those hospitals to the UN, who were then sharing them, you know, with the other antagonists. But the Russians and the Syrians were then typing those grid references into their targeting systems, and bingo, the next day we'd get a rocket through these hospitals. So people were, you know, incredibly frustrated. And one of the things that kept me going and kept them going. I said, look, you know, I fought in the Bosnian War 20 years ago, and some of those generals and then some of those people who committed atrocities are now either in jail or are being committed at the International Criminal Court. So whatever you think, you collect evidence, and at some stage, those responsible will pay for it. So that, to me, that was very, very compelling indeed. Going on to your point about, you know, the biological and chemical weapons, I think one thing I say in the book, and say quite a lot, you know, if you have no morals or scruples, chemical weapons and biological weapons are brilliant. You get an incredible bang for your buck. If you're a terrorist, they're the ultimate terror weapon, and that is why they would use them. Incidentally, Osama bin Laden for a long time thought that chemical and biological weapons were even beyond his pale. But that's certainly not the view of the jihadists and ISIS now. And when you look at Salisbury, you know, I think the Russians, we could debate for hours on why the Russians committed a chemical attack in Salisbury on British soil. But I think one of them is they were emboldened. I personally think Assad is still in power because he used chemical weapons. And interestingly enough, only today, one of his bloggers, one of these dreadful people who push out his propaganda and disinformation, is saying today on the internet, why on earth did we give up our chemical weapons? Because, you know, the world's let us down. If we still had them, people would listen to us, which is an absolute shock. But I think the Russians were emboldened, and they just didn't think anybody would do anything if they used chemical weapons. I mean, it just seemed bizarre that they used, you know, Novichok with sort of fourth generation nerve agent, incredibly toxic. It could have killed thousands of people in Salisbury. It was pure luck and the brilliance of the police and the British military and the security services that it didn't. But they were emboldened. I mean, they didn't think anybody would do anything. And I think Putin does not really care much for collateral damage anyway. I've been slightly at the buck at his anger, which has caused some nervousness. But I'm pretty clear, if I was a Russian, I would probably suffer the same fate as Alexei Navalny or Litvinenko. The fact that I'm not is I'm inconsequential to him. But I think that is the fact that he is prepared to use them is because he believes that nobody will do anything about it. And that brings out a wider story to the world that, you know, unless we really tighten up the Chemical Weapons Convention and have a biological weapons convention. I mean, we do have a biological weapons convention. It's funded about $100,000 a year, whereas the Chemical Weapons Convention, I think, is funded to about $200 or $300 million to do its job. And the reasons for it, the biological lack of funding is, we won't go into it here, but if we are to police it and make sure that biological weapons do not become an issue. And COVID has, I'm supposed to be a great biological security expert, but COVID completely blindsided me. People like me have been looking at highly toxic pathogens like anthrax, and I describe in the book dealing with a potential Al-Qaeda anthrax attack in Iraq. But having a not very toxic pathogen that highly transmissible, got us all down. And COVID has had such an impact. We cannot leave it like that. We must make things better. Again, a very long sort of answer to your question, Stephen. We're in a different world now than we were back in 30 years ago at the Gulf War. And I hope that the integrated strategic defense review that we're about to hear about in 2 weeks really does reflect that. But there is a dichotomy, I think, here. They're in a real challenge where, the environment and threats, cyber, chemical and biological, are changing things. And the natural thing to do would be to say, right, well, we don't need all these tanks and aircraft and ships and all the rest of it. We need something else to deal with it. Well, we certainly need the capability to deal with these contemporary weapons, as it were. But we also need those people. One of the things that I'm I'm so hugely proud of the British military is the men and women in it, and the way that they approach these things. I mean, it is a little bit like Tommy this and Tommy that and others at times, but putting young people in war zones it's hugely challenging, and I think we've had a few issues, but I think generally do a fantastic job. But even in the future, we still need we still need an amount of people to be able to achieve an effect. And I just hope that we don't slash our numbers to replace it with technology. For one, the amount of military personnel involved in COVID delivery, military aid to the civil authorities is huge. If we slash it too much, we're not going to be able to do that sort of thing. So a long answer to your question. We're approaching a new era. I think we must be reflective for the threats that are out there, so that we protect our people. We might need a slightly different military, I expect, but we still need boots on the ground, as it were. You still need to engage with people on the ground, and of course, the art of war is winning without fighting, and you need people to be able to win that sort of war.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by what you say about new challenges, Hamish, because at the same time, you've mentioned in the course of this webinar two weapons, anthrax, which you studied as a possible one, and chlorine, which you saw the horrible effects of. Both of those were used extensively in the First World War, and we rather thought we'd buried them in the aftermath of World War I. Neither was used in World War II, a minor use of chemical weapons on the battlefield, but the horrors of chemical substances in World War II were in the concentration camps, not on the field of battle. And it troubles me greatly that 100+ years after World War I ended, we still don't really have the apparatus for dealing either medically, physically, or legally with weapons that we've known about for a century.
I think that is one of the great dichotomies, that almost for 100 years chemical weapons were not used. It wasn't until the Iran-Iraq war that they were used, and then Halabja, 1988, when Saddam Hussein in his Anfal campaign dropped a huge amount of chemical weapons on the town of Halabja, killing over 17,000 people. A place I've been to many times and really started my affiliation with the Kurds. But I think it goes back to the point I was making earlier. These are brilliantly effective weapons. The fact that they were not used in the Second World War, I think, really kept them off the streets, as it were, for that length of time. The theory goes that Adolf Hitler was gassed in the First World War, and that had a profound effect on him. And he also believed that the Allies were possessed the sort of nuclear bomb way before him. But the fact they weren't used for 100 years, the fact that they have been used extensively in Syria and, in my opinion, kept Assad in power, has really put them back, on everybody's lists. And when we look at something like Novichok, which was designed by the Russians to overmatch NATO's capabilities to defend against it, I think we really got to make sure that we do get processes in place and firm up the Chemical Weapons Convention to make sure that these weapons aren't used, because there will always be weapons in war. But the really abhorrent thing about chemical and biological weapons is they tend to kill and injure innocent civilians who have no protection against them. At least soldiers have gas masks and other things, and they're completely indiscriminate. And if anything, positive comes out of Salisbury, will be a redefining of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And the point that you were making and Stephen making earlier on is, how do we get the UN and the UN Security Council to become an organization that actually agrees new legal frameworks without the Chinese or the Russians vetoing anything that they don't particularly like or acts against their national interests.
I mean, I pick up on Chris's point earlier that we need to enforce what we've got as well. But I think there is a gloss to what you've just said, Hamish, and I'll sort of pass it back to Chris if I may. And that is that from a domestic political point of view, there is also a challenge. It's a particular challenge for democracies, but of course, in autocracies, there's rather a less sort of caring approach to the people necessarily. But in a democracy, it's quite difficult to get consent through the votes in Parliament for large amounts of money in order to have the government set up its own insurance policy against an unknown, maybe may never happen event. Because most taxpayers are thinking, why should the government hoard my money? And so it's very difficult whether you're designing the armed forces for the future rather than the past, or whether you're designing whether we should have lots and lots of PPE in stock all over the country so we could be ready to respond. That's very difficult to secure through a political process of allocating the necessary resources to do something contingent like that. And that's maybe, I'm postulating, maybe one of the lessons that is drawn from the COVID experience in the light of all the expertise and experience that you've described of where it's used in hostile arrangements, but being international, so easily translated back to our domestic scene, is that maybe we will decide that it's worth having a much better contingent preparation to meet these threats, so we don't have to then run around chasing once the evidence is before our eyes. That's a sort of gloss to what you said. It's a hope, I think, more than maybe an expectation, but I think it's worth aiming for.
Stephen, thank you. I think this is a good point at which to switch to the questions that we've had, and we've got a series of very interesting ones. Let me put the first question, which is from an anonymous questioner. Another form of biological warfare is depriving populations under occupation of COVID-19 vaccines, while the occupier vaccinates themselves as well as the settlers living in the occupied land. It just happens that the biological weapon is vaccine deprivation. Is this not biological warfare as well? What do you think of it from a legal and ethical point of view? Stephen, would you like to have a first crack at that?
I think this is a very, very clearly topical, but also extremely difficult question. I think it's very easy for me to give you the answer that we should have vaccine equity and that all populations should be treated with the same level of access and tiered need, because you cannot beat the phrase that until everybody's safe, no one's safe from these highly transmissible international border crossing pathogens. But there will just be an intervention to some degree, both of politics and the marketplace. And to some degree, where people have done the huge expenditure on research, and therefore, if you like, to be rather sort of blunt about, sort of legal way, 9/10 of a possession is effectively becomes yours. You will treat your own people first, particularly, it has to be said, when you're trying to make sure you have the support and the democracy of your own people, and you're wanting a return on that big effort. So I think there is a big question to be answered as to how we stop this being used or abused in a way which puts people under a subjugation. I don't have a ready answer for it, but I think we're in that debate now. I can guess the part of the geographic world that you're referring to. There will be a supply and demand issue, but I think the main thing is equity. But maybe, Chris, you have a view on whether the law bites on that, and Hamish will certainly have a view on whether technically I'm on the right ground.
Well, the law bites on it in this sense that an occupying power has a clear legal responsibility for the health of the population of the occupied territory. It's quite different from the sort of broader moral question and practical question of how can we be safe unless we vaccinate others? Should we not vaccinate others? But Hamish, I'd be interested in your perspective on this question.
Well, I have very real experience of this again in Syria and in Idlib province, which is the one area not under regime control now, area about the size of Wales. 4 million people trapped in it, dealing with COVID as well. The last time I had discussions with people there, and other people in the audience might know a lot better than me, for those 4 million people, there were only a handful of ventilators to protect them. Very few medicines to help these people. They certainly weren't getting anything from the Syrian regime. And of course, most of the UN humanitarian aid is now funneled through the Syrian regime. But actually, bizarrely, because so many people are malnourished in Idlib province and are generally young, the death rates and else are fairly small, certainly compared to this country. But what hope that they will get vaccinated in the near future? I very much hope that the British government, and we do seem to be doing well on the vaccine front. And I had my vaccine yesterday, which is the silver bullet out of this nightmare. For us here in the UK and for everybody around the world. And I agree with Stephen. Everybody's got to be done before we're safe. And it's a huge challenge. But I agree with the questioner. This is a form, of biological warfare. And as you say, Christopher, withholding medical aid from an occupying power, that is clearly wrong. And hopefully, as the vaccine becomes more available, then everybody is going to get a go at it. But there's not a simple solution, as Stephen has said.
Thank you very much. Now, there's an interesting question that follows on from that, from Martin Britnell, former UK military Surgeon General, and now Professor at King's College London. He thanks the two of you for a stimulating discussion, but adds, I would value your thoughts on the potential role for the UK as an exemplar for the ethical use of military force, or whether our own reputation has been tarnished by our associations with allies or coalitions over the past 20 years. I don't know, Stephen, whether you'd like to have first crack at that.
Well, I better declare an interest, I think, because one of my 3 children is now a rising senior officer in the army, in the rifles. So one of these boots on the ground. And he's the first to say how much he feels that his job is equally, clearly he is training and being a soldier, just like Hamish's past. But at the same time, he is also very proud of the fact that he is part of a British army, which is sending, on the basis of country-to-country agreements, contingents of our British Army officers to go and train units of the Nigerian army, for instance, on the way human rights law bites into their role and what they have to be thinking about, even when they are under orders and in combat, which is to do with justifications and the rules of war, or to train anti-poaching people in Gabon, for instance. I mean, these are all part of the wider skill base being used for non-combat affairs, but I think part of what, even acknowledging that there will always be very differing views about the use of the British armed forces and the tremendous professionalism that they've demonstrated over many, many decades. Nonetheless, I think the fact that they're held in such high reputation around the world, and I certainly echo Hamish's concerns that if we reduce them too far, that will be at risk. But I do think that is not undeserved because of the way that the doctrine and the military training. And it was very interesting when I was in Parliament. I had the privilege of being able to go and at least witness Sandhurst training of our officers. And I came out thinking, perhaps with my background in business, that the core business of Sandhurst was not so much teaching people war fighting. It was actually teaching leadership and how do you maintain constant excellence in training. And those were the cores of the way the army certainly works. I don't have as much insight into the other 2 of the tri-services. So I would answer quite positively that I think we've got a reasonably well-earned reputation. And I think the soldiers and the other members of the armed forces have shown professionalism in acting out the orders which ultimately come from the politicians. And I think it's the politicians for whom you should hold account. But the reputation of the armed forces, I think, is sound.
Yes, thank you. Well, if we're declaring interests, I should declare a similar interest, because although I'm a career civilian, my daughter is an army officer, one of my two daughters.
They are.
Served in Afghanistan. So yes, it's very, very difficult. Now, two questions on Syria, which I'm going to put together, if the questioners will forgive me, and then push to Hamish first of all. What hope is there for IHL when states clearly contravene it in Syria and Yemen, etc.? Do the panel think the Biden administration will put the teeth back into IHL and the UN Security Council? And there's also a question here: how does the panel think the Syria conflict will be brought to an end? There seems little hope from where I sit in Syria.
Yeah, let me take that first. It's as I said at the very beginning, the Syrian people are very, very close to my heart, and I do feel that we have been let down. You know, what is the end of the Syrian conflict? One of the other unfortunate second-order issues with COVID is that places like Syria, or Syria in particular, have been very much put on the back burner. You know, when was the last Syrian piece on the news? You know, I've done a lot of work with journalists and others throughout time and done many pieces on Syria, but I haven't done anything for the last year, and it's sort of forgotten. And you know, Syria is at the edge of the Mediterranean, and when we look at we were talking about interventions earlier on, you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is Syria and the Levant, which is, you know, this is where ISIS, the jihadis, the breeding ground. These are the people that have impact in this country from a terrorist perspective. And by not engaging there, it's like playing football with just a goalie. We've got to get out to make sure that we keep terror away. But when it comes to Syria, you know, there has been, I know when Stephen was in DFID and FCDO now, I'm sure, you know, somebody on this call will tell us that we've, you know, given over £3 billion worth of aid to Syria. But actually, you know, that is not changing the political landscape in Syria. What is a good solution for Syria? I'm one who hope that, you know, we will, you know, there will be an end to the fighting there, and there will be, you know, a chance for the international community to rebuild that country. But I fear with the Russians now so entrenched and their strategic requirements for a air base and a sea base in the Mediterranean achieved, you know, they are, you know, very unlikely to give much ground there. So I slightly fear for that, and the person who is putting this question from Syria, you know, I very much do feel for them, and it goes back to the point, you know, that I think, you know, this is an intervention we should have done some time ago, but looking back is not going to help at all. I think we must move forward, and I am very positive about the new president, and I think President Biden has already indicated that he is prepared to make up some of the ground perhaps we've lost in the last 4 years. You know, rejoining the World Health Organization and the hugely important funding that Americans put into that will give teeth to that organization that has a key role to play here and has had, you know, a lot of criticism. I think a lot of it perhaps, you know, unfair, and that will be a positive thing. I think if Biden will engage more in the Middle East rather than using, you know, strategic missiles that stand off so far to take out individual targets, then there is a chance that we will have some sort of more positive resolution. But until the UN, the World Health Organization, and I expect the key players in the UN Security Council focus again on Syria, I feel we're going to get more of the same for the next few years. So I'm positive that the new president, and we need to support him, and I hope that the British government will do that.
Thank you very much. Stephen, I want to come to you with a question here. How will significant reductions in the overseas development budget affect Britain's role in the world? Have we had the rug pulled from under us?
Well, I hope not. But of course, I am passionate about our commitment to having the necessary predictable funding for our role as global citizens, and particularly with our enormous technical experience and expertise of how do you do humanitarian response and development. And it was part of the World Humanitarian Summit back in May 16 that we tried also to make sure that we understood how to get the nexus between those two responses and our participation in the multilateral instruments that enable all that to happen. And obviously it was my job to seek to coordinate a lot of that response. But and I think the 0.7% law, of which I'm obviously proud to be a co-architect, is very important. And the recent announcement that because of the current fiscal challenge, which of course COVID has brought on everybody, means that that's going down to 0.5%. And there's currently a discussion in government. I can see that there's going to be a big challenge on funding, and it will fall, sadly, on the discretionary funding, which is mainly programs in overseas countries rather than our subs to the UN and so forth. And linked to the previous question, I too welcome Biden's election and approach to the rejoining of the multilateral rules-based system, not least because of two excellent appointments in Linda Thomas-Greenfield as the US's permanent representative, who I work with closely in Africa, and Samantha Power, who used to have that job and is now head of USAID, because I think she will bring a very clear-eyed human rights perspective to that as well. And I think that's a great team that helps us realize that, yes, we will need to get back to that level of UK commitment. And I hope therefore the reduction to 0.5%, notwithstanding DFID folding into FCDO, will find itself back there. And we might even make up the difference in the years to come as our fiscal position improves post-COVID and the recovery, which I'm confident we will manage. And I think, therefore, the temporary effect it could have upon reputation of the UK with states in these areas could be important and may be diminishing. And that is a serious issue, both in terms of our ability to do aid, humanitarian response, but also trade, to be frank, as well. And I think that the way to mitigate that is to show real determination to work through the multilateral system and to show that we are strong players in the way that we work with others to give maximum effect to support people where necessary. I mean, I think it is important that it's linked to a confidence that whilst I do worry that, for instance, and as you were just discussing, the end of the Syrian conflict, I mean, I hope, of course, it's not going to be on the back of Idlib being wiped out either by COVID or by an attack. I don't rule that out, I'm sad to say, but let's hope it's not, or that something else intervenes to make it difficult. But already we're under challenge because and again, it goes back to some of these legal mechanisms, Sukrita, which you're so familiar with, and that is that the agreements between us around the world, and why the UN's Charter, which is an amazing document, has survived 75 years, more or less without amendment. But despite starting with we the peoples, it's actually a complete discussion about the states of the world and who's prepared to stand up as a state rather than people. And so the whole thing is dependent upon the way states behave and depends upon borders. And so the whole of this is linked to whether we can try and find a way of being accountable that is much more individual and collective rather than necessarily dependent upon the states. That's why I worry terribly on Syria, that the UN process, which has lasted for years, and as I said earlier, Stefan de Mistura did his very best to try and bring the parties together, but it's been hijacked by a sort of tailor-made Russian, Iranian, Syrian process called Astana, where the UN's allowed occasionally to turn up. But Astana isn't motivated to end the conflict in Syria, particularly if the end of the conflict in Syria might mean some form of accountability. And that's exactly what they want to avoid. So it's much better to have a process which never ends. So there's a sort of, I'm afraid I'm sort of glass half full, half empty on that one.
Right, now we're running short of time. I've got two questions I'm going to pick here, and my apologies to those who've asked the ones I haven't been able to pick. The first, of which I'd be grateful for a quick view from both of you, from a donor rep. Is the civil-military development nexus really the way forward when we have little overhead protection from the UN Security Council? Governments have run rings around us. Hamish, what do you think?
Well, I think the civil military nexus is absolutely key, and I like Stephen. I hope that the reduction in the budget is a COVID issue rather than goes further forward, because I think it's fundamental. And to step back a little, I'm a fan of DFID and the FCO being joined, and I actually would like to see a much closer relationship with the Ministry of Defence. Certainly, my experiences in Afghanistan, where the humanitarian piece should have been very much integrated. I got involved in alternative cropping in Afghanistan. I was actually in an intelligence role because I had a degree in agriculture, and actually some fantastic things could have been done, but there was just a missing piece there. So I think the military have a huge role to play, and I think on the humanitarian side, I feel, I really feel for the humanitarians who work in war zones, because I think they have a really difficult part to play here, and unless they are fully integrated and wrapped up with the other agencies there, it's difficult. But the key point here is the point that I think you make, Christopher, that without the umbrella, particularly of the UN Security Council, to make sure that these things can happen with general consensus in the UN, it's going to be tremendously difficult. And that's why, I'm pleased that Biden is now the president who hopefully will have the ability to get things moving in the UN and hopefully get the Russians and the Chinese on board so that we can be more active and achieve more in this area.
Stephen, would you like to add something?
Just very briefly, I think there's no question the civil military nexus is proven beyond degree to be one of the best instruments for humanitarian survive and thrive strategies wherever you need them from the natural disaster world. The trouble is that's such a small proportion of the need of the world for humanitarian response. So the big question for Civ Mil is, how do you get that to be acceptable and legitimate into conflict zones? And it ties back to something Sir Christopher said earlier, and that is there's such a reluctance in the international diplomatic and other instruments to, we all feel very constrained when we're in those jobs, to interfere in the internal affairs of another state. And that makes it almost impossible when you're sitting around the UN Security Council table, as I know to my cost. You try to advocate something and you're told, no, that's the internal affairs. Assad's perfectly entitled to, if 6.5 million people of his own people want to flee their homes internally, you've got no role. And there's no way that you should be supplying any kind of food or support or blankets for them. And so there is this problem about being able to get in. And this is where the military are so often clearly not invited in to a conflict area. And I think that's where the debate now lies, as to how could we legitimize some form of probably non-uniformed use of our military personnel primarily, but also assets, to help deliver protected and objective humanitarian aid, conforming with IHL. So you meet the need first. Take Yemen at the moment. There's a lot of money available, but it is unfortunately coming from a source which is a party to the war and only wants to supply the side that it's supporting, whereas a lot of the need is actually on the other side, and it basically needs a ceasefire. So you stop talking about sides and you talk about need. So I am concerned about that. As for the bigger question, which is ultimately whether the UN should have a role, given I think it's pretty forlorn to hope that somehow the P5 are going to be motivated to give up their veto. For the UN Security Council to have any form of way of doing better than it does at the moment, where things are pretty well stuck, is whether it moves from a peacekeeping mandate to having some form of peacemaking mandate. This is a big question. I'm not going to pretend to go into the depth of it now, but I do think it's a point worth making, because that could just be one of the keys to help unlock that blockage.
Yes, thank you. One thing just on this question of the civil-military development nexus. When I started working purely as an academic in this field in the 1980s, there was, I thought, a real suspicion on the part of the people I met from the various humanitarian NGOs of anything to do with anyone's military.
Yeah.
I don't hear that nowadays. Not with people who work in relief aid and so on. You hear it more often from people who've never set foot in anything outside the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Ironically, much more enthusiasm for working with the army in delivering relief supplies in Africa than there is from some people in the NHS in having the military involved in vaccination programs against COVID. But it's
spot on, except that's with our army. I mean,
Yeah.
we still had the problem of, in northeastern Nigeria, getting the NGOs to be anywhere near. The only way you could get a convoy to the girls who'd been taken hostage in the forest was to go with the Nigerian army as they pushed the bow wave forward. And the real problem was, of course, you didn't want, none of the NGOs want to be with the Nigerian army. So I'm not going to make any comment about the Nigerian army. The point is, it was with an army they felt they could trust on the grounds that, you know, we've referred to on the British Army earlier. So I think it's a long way better, but not over. Chris.
Okay, one last question, which I'm going to put just for a quick 2 minutes from each of you, and then we must stop. And that is perhaps the most fundamental question of the lot. Does the UK have a foreign policy in the Middle East? Hamish.
Well, that is a great question. I should really palm that off to Stephen, I expect. Certainly in my experience, working with the Kurds and in Syria over the last 5 years, it's been very difficult to understand exactly what that policy is and what is bounded by it. I found it tremendously difficult to get anything more than verbal support for activities. And I go back to one of the points I made at the very, very beginning. You know, Syria is such a fundamental country and its security to the security of the United Kingdom that we must have some foreign policy that enables that. And at the moment, I'm just not sure. I think the question is fundamental and great, and it would be wonderful to have the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Rabb, here to explain exactly what the British foreign policy is in the Middle East. I hope moving forward, and again, once the fog of COVID has lifted, that we can refocus again on the Middle East, because from a terror and military perspective, you know, that is the hotbed, and that is the area that is going to be most threatening to the UK, particularly from a terror perspective.
Hamish, thank you. Dominic Rabb, of course, who many of us remember as a legal advisor in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office before he went.
Indeed so. Very, very briefly, but I think it's very difficult to say that there's a foreign policy for the Middle East. I think we do have items of foreign policy that bear on the Middle East, particularly the continued adherence to a two-state solution for the Israel-Palestine issue, the support through the UN for aid to the occupied Palestinian territories, which is obviously a phrase which, when used even at the UN, the Israelis will always come in and see you and object to very strongly. We are, I think, somewhat cagey, to say the least, in having to make choices between where there are developing and very difficult splits within the Middle East. So the sort of Turkey, Qatar axis versus the sort of Saudi, Egypt, UAE axis. And these are state axes as against the Sunni Shia issues and the whole issue about Iran. But I think that we've got elements of a Middle Eastern policy. I think it's quite difficult to have a holistic one, other than to say we would like to see peace everywhere. Of course we would, but to do that, you're going to have to be much more fine-grained. And at the moment, putting a series of sort of strong bilateral efforts together runs the risk of us being uncoordinated and not quite sympathizing with the way that the region itself sees itself, which is a part of the way of making quite disputatious alliances, which is tricky. And of course, at the moment, whilst I'm absolutely with Hamish in the horror and the complete disappointment in the international community's ability to be able to tackle an end to Syria, my obsession at the moment is the absolute horror that's going on in Yemen, which I described and termed the world's worst humanitarian disaster back in quite early 2016. And I see as being repeated even now. So, yeah, we're not making progress on that one. And some pretty obvious choices that we need to make in order to try and bring that to an end. And in fairness, I think President Biden has started to give us a bit of a pathway.
Stephen, thank you very much. I'm afraid at that point we're going to have to leave it, and I'd like to just wrap everything up. I see a message here saying that there have been lots of WhatsApp messages from message questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to everything people have asked. But let me thank very much Sir Stephen O'Brien, who brought his political and humanitarian experience to bear on this, and Hamish de Bretton Gordon, the author of Chemical Warrior, who brings the experience of years as one of the boots on the ground, both first in the military and then afterwards in his post-military career. It's very humbling for me as somebody who sits here largely in a university rather than having been involved in that direct way. But thank you both very much. And can I also take this opportunity to thank the various organisers of this seminar today, Adam Coutts, but also Bradley Robinson, but also the institutions, the University of Cambridge, King's College London, Magdalen College, Cambridge, which is perhaps a little overrepresented, as you're an Emmanuel man yourself, I think, Stephen.
I am indeed. So I've got the tie on to prove it.
Yes, there's no need to feel embarrassed about that. But also RH4C and the Global Challenge Research Fund. Thank you very much for arranging this, and to our participants, thank you for taking part. It's been, I think we'd all agree, a most stimulating discussion. So may I wish you